Hi, everyone, and welcome. This is Jeff Klapes from the Reference Department at BB Library, and welcome to the Traveling Librarian. Since we can't travel much further these days than the supermarket, I'm hoping to inspire you with some armchair travel instead. And WCAT has generously partnered with BB Library here in Wakefield to help us continue to bring our programming to you in any way we can. So I'm pleased to have you join me today for a tour of the kind of off the beaten track destination of Malta. To see more armchair travel photography, I hope you'll follow me on Instagram using either my name, Jeff Klapes, or hashtag _traveling_librarian. I took this trip in the spring of 2019, just a year ago, in my quest to eventually visit all of the European micro-countries, because Malta is actually one of the tiniest countries in the world. Like Sicily, Malta is at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, smack in the middle. It was originally settled by people from Sicily almost 8,000 years ago. It's a tiny island only about 60 miles south of the coast of Sicily, and it's less than 200 miles from the coast of Africa. It is one of the world's smallest countries, but very densely populated. You can see from this outline overlaid over the Boston area that the main island is only about 15 by 5 miles. And there's a separate island called Gozo just to the north that's considerably smaller. So the whole thing fits in between Boston and Lowell. The history of the island is quite interesting and covers a variety of different time periods, from the prehistoric, then through the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Aragonese, the Knights of Malta for over 300 years. There was a brief French period when Napoleon captured the islands from the Knights of Malta on his way to Egypt. And then it became a British colony. And finally, in 1964, it became a completely independent nation, joined the European Union in 2004, and began using the euro currency in 2008. Here you can see the roads that I took while I was there. Many people who go to visit Malta go on cruise ships, and they tend to stop only for a few hours in the capital and don't see much more beyond that. But it is well worth spending additional time. I was there for almost 2 weeks, so it gave me a real good opportunity to go poking around a lot of the lesser visited corners. And I spent several days on the other main island as well. We're going to start in Valletta, which is the capital, and it has one of the world's best natural harbors. There are only about 6,000 people in the walled city itself, the historic part of the city, but the area around it has most of the island's population. It was originally founded by the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, in the 16th century after the Great Siege of the island in 1565, which is an important event that we'll come back to a few times through the course of this tour. The Ottomans took the Fort St. Elmo at the very tip of the city, but the Knights eventually won that battle. And shortly thereafter, they began constructing the new city of Valletta, which was named for the Grand Master of the Knights, whose name was Jean de la Valette, the hero of the siege. And many of the fortifications are still visible. Old Valletta is still a UNESCO heritage site today. It's quite historic and retains much of the original architecture and fortifications from that time period. The Knights were a religious order and a military religious order. They had been driven out of Rhodes from the Ottoman Empire in 1522. And then in 1530, Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, gave the islands to the Knights in a perpetual lease, for which they had to pay an annual tribute to the emperor of one single Maltese falcon, which is where that iconic idea comes from. And here, just at the entrance plaza to the city, is a tall column with a Maltese falcon at the top. Right nearby is the Triton Fountain, which is also a major landmark as you enter the new city. As much as Valletta is very old, there's a significant amount of modern architecture there as well. This is the new modern Parliament building, which was designed by Renzo Piano in 2015. Renzo Piano is a famous Italian architect who has also built things all over the world. The one that he's most famous for locally is the very modern addition to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum right here in Boston. These buildings here are the Parliament buildings. Just around the corner is the Auberge de Castile. The time period when the knights ruled Malta, it was divided into what were called 8 languages or orders. There was Aragon, Auvergne, Castile, Leon and Portugal, England, France, Italy, Germany, and Provence. And each one of these orders had their own auberge, and they're almost like a guild. So they were a powerful influence that worked together to rule the island. This particular one was rebuilt in the 1740s in Spanish Baroque style, and it is now the office of the Prime Minister of the country. This is an interesting outdoor music and arts center where the 19th century opera house used to stand. The opera house was destroyed in World War II. We'll talk a bit more about Malta's experience during the war a little bit later. And it was finally rebuilt again as an open air performance space by Renzo Piano, the same architect who did the new Parliament buildings. Here you can see a historic photo of what the original opera house looked like before it was destroyed in the war. Valletta has a very grid pattern orientation to the city, which is unusual for such an old city. It was designed for security and military fortification. So as old a city as it is, it doesn't have all the twisty medieval streets that you might expect from a city from that time period. There are just long, very straight streets horizontally and vertically through the city. This is the main road called Republic Street. It's the main avenue, which is almost entirely pedestrianized and goes from one end of the city to the other. Here's the Grand Harbor Hotel where I stayed. There are a number of very nice hotels in downtown Valletta and in the surrounding area as well. My room was on the very top floor over on the right and had a spectacular view over the harbor. The Maltese Islands are a kind of odd combination of Mediterranean and British, and we'll see that quite a bit as we wander around the island. So here is a very traditional Maltese building, but of course right in front of it is a traditional British phone box. One thing that you'll see all over the city, and in fact all over the islands, are these unusual bay windows that stick out from almost every building. They're called gallerias, and they were originally started on the Grand Master's palace, which we'll see shortly, and because he built them, everyone else started to imitate them as a style, and now almost every building has them in some form or another. They do allow for extra space over the very narrow streets, and they also let in light and air, which is nice in an island that can get very hot during the summer. One of the most famous visitors to Malta is St. Paul, who was shipwrecked there and converted the local governor to Christianity. This was in about the year 60. He has a church dedicated to him in Valletta, which has his relics. There's a wrist bone. On the right, you can see part of the column on which he was eventually beheaded in Rome, and his statue, which is paraded through the streets on his feast day in February. Here's some graffiti, which is worth mentioning just because it touches on the current political issues going on in the Mediterranean. As I'm sure you're aware, there is a significant refugee crisis in the Mediterranean as poor and people from poverty and war-torn countries in the Middle East, especially Syria, and also in Africa, are trying to find their way into Europe for a better life, but this is causing significant problems to the Southern European nations who have to deal with the refugees as they land on their borders, and also the significant problems of unscrupulous people who are trying to charge money to bring them across the Mediterranean on extremely dangerous boat voyages where many people often die. This particular graffiti is pointing out that in Malta, at least, unlike some other countries, particularly Italy, the current Italian government, Malta does not consider being a refugee to be a crime, and the Maltese have been active in trying to rescue and save people who have been desperately trying to cross the Mediterranean in flimsy boats. Much more into the past is a very different aspect of Malta. This is the National Museum of Archaeology, which has a fabulous collection of ancient artifacts. It's housed in the former Auberge de Provence, another one of the auberge groups that managed the country during the Middle Ages. Malta has an extremely long history, and one of the things that makes it a fascinating place to visit is to not only see medieval and modern history, but also to see Neolithic history, because there are some of the oldest ruins in the world are on the islands that we'll get to see shortly. The temple culture started around 5000 BC and has a very distinctive, unique style, which you will see in both the museum and also as we tour the island and see the ruins themselves. This is an example of, this is a model actually of one of the temples that we'll visit later. The style, as you can see, is very unusual and has a very almost feminine style with multiple apses that were used for worship. It's not entirely sure what a lot of the early culture was all about because we know so little about it. But we'll see more about that later when we look at the actual temples themselves. There are many old mansions throughout the city of Valletta that are open to the public. This one is called Casa Rocca Piccola, which has 50 rooms and is still owned by the original family. And members of the family will take you on a tour. Under the house, this is a stairway going down to the old cisterns, which were used for bomb shelters during World War II. Here's another Baroque mansion with gallerias that is now used as the police station. There are gallerias on virtually every building that you see. Another great thing about Malta is the food. It's very typically Mediterranean, but it also has influences from a number of different places. Being a British colony for so long, there's certainly British influence. You can get tea and meat and two-veg kinds of dinners that are very hearty, but they also are influenced, as you might imagine, by Italian food, particularly Sicily, which is very close by, and also Africa, Northern African food, and other types of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern foods. This is the national dish, which is stewed rabbit, which is quite good. Ironically, although rabbits were once plentiful on Malta, they've killed them all and hunted them virtually to extinction. So most of the rabbit that you get in the restaurants is imported from elsewhere. This is a typical Maltese salad with sausage, beans, special local sausages and cheese, olives, capers, sun-dried tomatoes, and a variety of other things, along with crusty bread and very good wine. Malta has excellent volcanic and good soil for growing both red and white wine grapes. So there's a lot of interesting local wines to try while you're there. This is a view over the Grand Harbor from my hotel. And then the same views again from my hotel in the morning, where there's just an absolutely stunning view over this enormous, well-protected harbor. although the balcony is really skinny. If you don't happen to like heights, it might be difficult to go out there, particularly when it's windy. My hotel also had a very nice rooftop terrace, which was a great place to go, particularly at sunset, to just have a drink and watch the sunset over the harbor. There's many things to see in downtown Valletta. And as I said, if you happen to stop there for a brief period on a cruise and are only there for a few hours, there would be more than enough to see in Valletta to keep you busy. These are the Upper Baracca Gardens, high up on one of the bastions, the fortifications. It is now a public park with a great view. You can see all the way down the peninsula here. And you can also see across the harbor to what are known as the three cities, Cospicua, Vittoriosa, and Senglea, which we will visit shortly. And there are beautiful gardens to explore as well. This is the modern entrance to the city. Remember, I said Renzo Piano, the architect, completely redesigned this entrance. So you now walk through a modern version of the fortifications right into the plaza where the Parliament building is. The skyline of Valletta is dominated by the dome of the Carmelite Church and the spire of the Protestant pro-cathedral of St. Paul. Ironically, these two churches, although they look great on the skyline, are among the least interesting interiors to visit, but they're still worth the walk if you happen to be in that neighborhood. The fortifications, which you can pretty much walk all the way around the city, are absolutely enormous. And you can still see the original hospital where the Knights Hospitallers were based out of. The reason they have that name is because they started an early medieval hospital, the idea being that they provided medical care to people who were on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The hospital is now a museum that you can visit and a conference center. It's used it's used for weddings and other kinds of events. Along with the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers were two of the main military orders in Europe during that time period. The hospital was built in the 1570s along with the rest of the city after the siege of 1565. And originally it was built to house up to 2,500 patients. It's worth noting that all of those patients would have been men at that time. There were no women patients in this building. The main hospital room is 500 feet long. And this upper hall, the little doors that you can see on the right, are bathrooms, essentially, although with minimal amenities, but each bed had its own separate bathroom, one per patient, which is, interestingly, a better ratio than many modern 21st century hospitals have. Down below, this room, which is all decked out for an upcoming wedding, is the same length as the room we just saw upstairs, but it is below, has a slightly lower ceiling and vaulting. This was the room that was used for the poorer classes, again, all men, and these would have shared several, I believe it was 4 patients per bathroom. Just across the street is an interesting little area just below the walls with fishermen's shacks. And looking back, you can see the hospital is that long building right in the middle. In the very far distance is Fort St. Elmo, which was a very important part of the siege of 1565 and was the last of the forts to succumb to the Ottomans before the Knights finally turned things around and defeated them. This is the lower Baracca Gardens with a monument to Sir Alexander Ball. That's the temple in the background. He was beloved by the Maltese, a British gentleman, for helping them defeat the French in the beginning of the 19th century. And this is the Siege Bell War Memorial, which commemorates the siege of World War II. Malta was under siege for an extremely long period of time and suffered greatly during World War II, which many people are not terribly familiar with. The gentleman that you see here lying down is a memorial for all of those who were lost at sea. And looking across that same harbor, you can see the massive shipyard over in the neighborhood called Singlea, which we'll visit in a little bit. And another interesting aspect of Maltese politics, although much more recently, 3 years ago in 2017, the Maltese mafia killed a local journalist who was writing anti-corruption articles about the mafia. So she was killed in a bombing, and there is still a memorial to her even today, 3 years later. Probably the biggest site to see in the city of Valletta is called St. John's Co-Cathedral. It's built in the 18th century and was recently restored, and they're now building an additional museum along the side to house some of its collections. The exterior is not terribly exciting. However, the interior is absolutely spectacular. It's dedicated to John the Baptist, and so most of the artwork that you see has some connection to his life. The floor is completely covered from one end to the other with ornate marble tombs of more than 400 knights throughout the history of the knights. And each of the many gilt side chapels is connected with one of the auberges. The interior was mostly decorated by the artist Mattia Preti, who was a Calabrian artist from southern Italy and also a knight. And he painted the ceiling with scenes from John's life. Off to the side is a fabulous oratory with a massive painting that you can see in the background by Caravaggio, which was painted in 1608, and it depicts the beheading of St. John the Baptist. It's one of Caravaggio's most famous works, and it's about 12 by 17 feet and has an oculus in the ceiling above it that lights it very beautifully in this setting. Caravaggio was actually very briefly a knight when he came to Malta to flee the city of Rome after accidentally killing someone there. But he didn't last very long. He was kicked out of the Knights 6 months later. He had quite an interesting life. This is the altar of the cathedral, which is also quite magnificent. It's worth spending a bit of time in the church to see all the detail, but it's also, being one of the most popular sites in Valletta, worth it to get there first thing in the morning so that you have at least a few minutes to yourself before the crowds arrive. Not far from there is the Grand Master's Palace. This is one of the main squares of the city. It's a building used for state functions and has a number of rooms open to the public. And it also is the site of the original Galleria. And you can see, because the Galleria is so long, it makes sense that it had that name. A gallery is usually something you expect to be fairly long. And after other wealthy people throughout the city started building their own homes with gallerias that may have only been 6 or 8 feet long, the name still stuck, but this is the building where they were originally invented. Inside, you can visit a number of the staterooms, including the throne room. And you can see on the exterior of the building a plaque that commemorates the siege of World War II, when it was decided to knight the entire population of the country for their valor during World War II. Here are some more fishermen's stalls along the lower edge right down by the water, and another typical street with my hotel perched way up in the background. There are many ways that you can cross the harbor, and it's well worth it to spend the time to do this, to see the many sites across in the Three Cities section. There's typical little traditional boats, but there are also any number of other ferries to quickly get you across the way. Here's a man much trendier than I, listening, smoking a cigarette and conducting business on his cell phone. But the ferry trip is beautiful. It gives you a great view back to the city of Valletta with all of its architecture, and also the three cities as you come into the long, narrow ports, and the marina is full of yachts. The three cities, we're going to start in the first one called Vittoriosa, which was originally known as Birgu, which is a traditional Maltese name, and it has a very modern marina. Senglea is right next to it and was also known as El Isla. The name comes from the Grand Master Claude de la Senglet, and here on the tip of that particular city is something called the Guardiola. This is an elaborate watchtower that's on the fortification at the tip of this peninsula, and it's a popular site for photographs because it has these unusual sculpted eyes and ears which symbolize watchfulness. Senglea has a lot of very narrow, sleepy streets. There's not much going on there, but it's a very nice place to just stroll around. And you can see back to Valletta over the marina. And another site that's well worth visiting is the fort of the massive Fort St. Angelo, which dominates the harbor at the end of Vittoriosa. This was the headquarters during the Great Siege of 1565. Here I am being trendy. The Great Siege, the fort of San Angelo actually existed in a smaller form at that time. It was rebuilt about 100 years later and now is a superb museum about the history of Malta in general, and particularly the military history of especially the siege of the 16th century. The Birgu neighborhood also is a little more vibrant than Senglea, but it's still a much sleepier part of the capital, and it has a very relaxed feel. This is the main piazza. There are lots of narrow streets with restored houses and a number of small museums, including this one, which is a museum of the Inquisition, which took place here as it did in many other parts of Europe. There's also a maritime museum. The building that you see in this photo is actually an old naval bakery that made ship's biscuits for long sea voyages, and it has now been turned into a museum tracing Malta's maritime history. And another view of the fort. The sunset over Valletta is absolutely beautiful. Most of the buildings are made of a very warm colored limestone that when the late afternoon sun hits them, they turn a lovely warm pink, rose, and orange. And then at night, the city is lit up and all kinds of street activity is going on. There are many restaurants, cafes, nightclubs. This is the original Galleria that we looked at before on the Grand Master's Palace lit up at night. There are all kinds of great things to eat. These are, if you've never had arancini, which are deep-fried arborio rice balls, they're popular in Italy as well. And Malta has their own versions. They're absolutely delicious as street food. And the view over the city is just gorgeous. This is the Galleria from my own hotel room. My bathroom had a tiny little door that allowed you to walk out onto this very, very skinny balcony that gave you a great view over the city. You might not be aware of it just looking at the city from far away, but it's actually a surprisingly steep city. It's built on a very high rocky outcrop, so there are a lot of stairs. Here's an unusual Galleria design. And here's another part of the Parliament Gate project at the entrance to the city with an older building behind it. This complex has been turned into a very modern shopping mall. But enough of Valletta. Let's start to head out into some of the countryside and see things that you might not get to see on a shorter visit to Malta. I love this store in just a perfectly ordinary neighborhood called Helpful Ironmongery, which was the local hardware store. This is in the suburb of Paolo, named after St. Paul. It's only a couple of miles from Valletta, and you can easily get there by bus. It's home to two of the most important prehistoric sites in the entire island of Malta. This first one, which is called the Al-Sifleni Hypogeum, goes back to 3000 BC. Photographs are not allowed in this underground temple complex, and there's very limited entry. So if you do want to go, it's important to book tickets well ahead of time because they don't take more than about 10 people at a time. This is a model of what this site looks like. It's in a perfectly ordinary suburban neighborhood, and was discovered when someone was trying to drill a well for water in their house, and they broke through into what turned out to be a very early, around 3100 BC time period. It's a necropolis, a cemetery essentially, and they found the remains of approximately 7,000 people in this maze of underground hand-dug caves. Very little is known about the cultures that built these structures. Not very far away, just a couple of blocks down the road, is an above-ground temple complex called Tarshin that dates to about that same time period. So we're talking, give or take, a little bit over 5,000 years ago. This temple gives you a better idea of the structure, the floor plan of how these early temples were built. Most of them were groups of apses with these rounded semicircular spaces made up of very large upright stones. And there's plenty of carving and detail in many of them. And of course, they found a good many artifacts, particularly sculptures, figurines, pottery, and so forth, most of which are now held in the various museum collections around the country. This huge jar, however, is not a replica. This is an original jar. It's a good 3 or 4 feet across. And in this doorway, which leads from one part of the temple to the other, you can see a couple of unusual little holes on either side of the door frame. They're not entirely sure what these were for, possibly hinges or straps. If the door had wooden panels to enclose it, they might have used leather or fabric or some other kind of rope to hold the panels in place, kind of like a door hinge. This figure that you can see here, known as one of the many fat ladies. Many of the figurines are of extremely voluptuous women with large breasts, large bodies, large legs, presumably some nod towards fertility. This is actually a reproduction, and the original can be seen in the museum. And here you'll see a miniature altar doorway on the left and the carved block right underneath, which has what looks like a broken piece in the middle. That block actually works like a drawer, and they don't know what that was for, but it is very finely carved so that you can slide it in and out as though it might have been used in some kind of ceremony. All over the site are these round stones, slightly bigger than bowling balls, which may possibly have been used as rollers to move the large blocks around, but they're not entirely sure. Moving a little further out, as we head clockwise around the island, is the village from Marsaxlokk, which is a great example of the very unusual Maltese language. Maltese uses our alphabet and is influenced by a lot of Italian words, being so close to Italy, but it is essentially a Semitic language and is very similar to Arabic in many ways. It's known as Malti in its own language, and you will find that although English is widely spoken in Malta, particularly having been a British colony for the past 150 years, Malti is still spoken all over the country, particularly by locals who tend to speak it among themselves, and they will speak English to any tourists. But Maltese is the primary language of most of the people who do live there. So the name of this town, which is a very lovely fishing port, Marsa, comes from the Arabic word meaning port, and shluk, which is the Maltese word for southeast, which refers to the Scirocco dry wind that comes across the Mediterranean from the Sahara. All of these colorful boats for which the harbor is known are called lutsu. They have traditional eye decorations on the front, which are an ancient Phoenician custom to protect sailors when they're out on the ocean. The harbor is known for its very photogenic backdrop of the church and the market and some excellent fish restaurants along the harbor front. This is absolutely a working fishing port, although it is a tourist destination as well, but it is one of the primary fishing ports out of the Maltese Islands, and you will get really excellent fish dinners in the restaurants all along this promenade. A little further away, in fact, just a couple of miles, it's a pretty pleasant hike if the weather is nice, is a town called Birzabuja. This is not a particularly touristy place, but it's a pleasant town, and it's really the only other big town on the East Coast. The main thing that it's known for is its extremely large harbor where container ships unload here. It's a very important part of Malta's economy, and it's actually one of the busiest container ports in all of Europe. The area around it, I took a nice sort of country walk on these empty roads in between the two towns. It's a very pleasant landscape. Most of Malta is very dry Mediterranean climate. It has a rolling rocky landscape, very few forests, and dry scrubby vegetation with lots of stone walls built up over the millennia. I was fortunate enough to be there in the spring, so there's plenty of beautiful wildflowers in bloom all over the island. Here's a better view of Birzabuja and the port. Right close to that town is a cave that you can visit, which is not terribly dramatic, and it's actually rather small, but it's a very important one for prehistoric finds. It's called Hardalam. Due to its island isolation, Malta had a lot of unusual species, many of which are now extinct, that because they were isolated on these small islands, they evolved into interesting directions. This is an example of a dwarf elephant that once roamed the islands, and also giant dormice. So if you're interested in that kind of prehistory, it's a nice museum to stop into. Given that I was the only person who had apparently been there all day, the gentleman running the place spent an awfully long time explaining every tiny detail to me. On the southern coast, moving again, we're kind of heading clockwise around to the south coast, looking towards Africa. The southern coast has very high cliffs and gorgeous dramatic views. That tiny islet that you can see off in the distance is completely uninhabited. It's now a protected seabird sanctuary, although for a number of decades it was used by the British Navy for bombing practice, but that has ceased and it is now a protected zone. There's a lot of good diving, scuba diving, and other kinds of water sports that you can do all over the island, as well as boat trips and so forth. Honey is also a major product, along with wine and olives. This is just one of the tiny villages along the south coast with a tiny little cove. Wildflowers were in profusion all over the island. Another reason to take a trip out of the capital to this southern coast, and mind you, it's only about maybe 7 miles total. You can easily get there by a rented car or by bus. Ajarkim and Nidra are adjacent early sites on the south coast. These are even earlier than the ones that we saw a few minutes ago at Tarshin. These are from about 3500 BC. And these are models showing you what they look like. Many of these sites have, unfortunately for tourists, have been covered with these structures that protect them from weathering, because since they are made of limestone, they are subject to erosion over long periods of time. So the government has protected them with these coverings. It takes a little bit away from the atmosphere of the site. But on the other hand, it is worth remembering that when these buildings were originally constructed, they did have roofs of their own. So in some ways, it gives you a better idea of what it would have been like to walk inside them when they did have coverings on them. This is one of the largest stones in any of the Maltese temples. It's over 15 feet high and weighs 20 tons. Here is another doorway carved, and you can see, as we saw earlier, the little holes in the middle that may have been used to secure a door panel. No one really knows what the roofs of these buildings were like. Presumably they weren't entirely made of stone, because you would still see remnants of those. It is suspected that they were made of gradually smaller courses of stone that formed a dome, but nobody knows entirely for sure what they were like. This is an original carving from the time period when they were built that gives you that kind of an idea, showing horizontal rows of stones that may have be an indication of what the building would have looked like. Limestone is a very suitable stone for carving because it's so soft, and it's readily available all over the islands. Here's a decorated altar with a sort of dotted design, carved dotted design. This is actually a replica. The original is in the museum in downtown Valletta. And in the museum at these temples, this is another of the fat lady figurines, which is a very typical design from the culture that lived here 5,000 years ago. You can see in many of the temple surfaces, there are these unusual designs, which are obviously artistic and not merely an accident. They were specifically done, carved into the soft rock in order to make a design. There's also a number of unusual holes that go from the inner temple to the outside. They think they were used as what they call oracle holes, where someone would speak from the outside, and in a very deep voice, it magnifies and projects the voice like a loudspeaker inside the temple for dramatic effect. Here we are looking west over the south coast to that adjacent temple called Nidra, which was built out of a much harder kind of limestone. Both of these temples have astronomical alignments. So the sun comes in during the solstices. These are also the only temples that look out over this southern coast to the ocean towards that small island of Fifla. So it's thought that people might have considered it because of that to be a sacred site. Sigioe is one of the many small towns sprinkled among the fields. Most of the towns on Malta are perched on little hills, and this one is a fairly good-sized one. All of them have an interesting character that's a strange mix of North African, Middle Eastern, and Italian. Of course, many of them have a typical Italian Catholic cathedral, usually in Baroque style, because that's when much of the architecture was built here. And almost all of them have a British, bright red British phone box as well. Mosta is one of the larger towns, and it's actually at this point so large that it's kind of become a part of the conurbation around the capital of Valletta. It's known for this massive church called the Rotunda, which after St. Peter's in Rome and St. Paul's in London, is considered the third largest dome in the world. The church is huge. You can see here in the interior. It was damaged in World War II by a bomb, which miraculously broke through the dome, landed in the floor, and did not actually explode. And another view from the outside. This is a great example of all the different aspects of Maltese culture coming together in one view. A very Italian Baroque church, a British phone booth, and palm trees all in one spot. Back in Valletta, I took a sunset boat trip right across the harbor to another one of the towns, a much more modern part of town called Sliema, which is not a terribly historic part of town. It's more of a residential zone and a tourist zone. The great thing about going there, though, is that you get a superb view back to Valletta with the skyline off in the distance, and it's in the right direction, so the sunset makes the town glow when you get there. But it's Sliema is mostly for clubs, beaches, hotels, resorts, bars, that sort of thing. If you like a lot of nightlife, it's a great place to stay. If you'd prefer to avoid that, it's probably better to stay in Valletta. This is actually just an interesting thing to talk about because Malta today has an extremely good and very inexpensive bus system. Public transit covers most of the island, and it is not really necessary to rent a car when you're there because the buses will very inexpensively go to almost any place that you'd like to go. The island is so small that it doesn't take more than an hour at most to get even to the farthest parts of the islands. This is an original style bus that up until a few years ago was the kind that bumped its way across the rutted roads across the island, and people still do have fond memories of them. But they've all been replaced with much more energy efficient and air-conditioned ones. So this old one has now been turned into a souvenir stall that roves around town. Being so close to Italy, it's hard to avoid gelato. And if you've spent the day doing lots of country walks or city walks, it's worth it to treat yourself some really good gelato and stroll around the town. It's a major cruise port, as I've mentioned before, although what has been happening in the past year with the cruise industry, who knows how much the cruise industry will bounce back after the coronavirus pandemic, whether people will still want to take large cruises of this type in the future. But Valletta has long been a popular destination for these kinds of ships because of its harbor, because of its location in the middle of the Mediterranean, and because Valletta is a great place to stop for even a brief trip of only a few hours. There's an awful lot to see there. Back on the south coast again, to get a little bit away from the city, there's great hiking along the coast and spectacular views of the southern cliffs and some locals. An interesting thing that I wanted to see, another bizarre and almost unknown part of Malta, is these cart ruts. This particular area is called Clapham Junction because they're named after the major railroad junction in southern England, where many railroad lines come together. The same is true here, but they are these early cart ruts that are kind of a mystery on the island. They aren't sure exactly when and how they were made. They're all over the island, but this is probably the single largest concentration of them. They are worn into the soft stone, possibly from sledges that were pulled by oxen and carrying heavy loads, or they may also have been dug over time by cartwheels, doing the same thing, gradually wearing down the soft limestone. But it's not entirely sure where these come from and why. Most of them have been dated probably to the Bronze Age, which is much later than the temple period that we've seen so far. But they make a fascinating mystery to visit, and you see they're extremely deep. Some of them are a good foot or even a foot and a half deep in places. Not far from Clapham Junction is the only remaining forested area on the entire island of Malta, called Busquet Gardens. The building that you can see in the center of the photo is a 16th century hunting lodge called the Verdala Palace, which is now used as the summer residence of the president of Malta. So you can't actually visit it, but the park around it is very beautiful and has orange groves, lovely places to walk, water features, and so forth. From the hill up on top, you can see all the way back to the north coast, where Sliema is over on the far left-hand side, where you can see lots of modern apartment buildings and condos and resort hotels. And then historic Valletta is off in towards the center right. More scenes in downtown Valletta with all the balconies and galleria. There is a historic market hall in Valletta that has been beautifully turned over into an indoor food court that has shops and restaurants serving Maltese food and selling all kinds of Maltese products, which is a great place to grab a quick bite to eat or a coffee. And another day with a beautiful sunset over the harbor. We're now going to move inland to Medina and Rabat. Medina is an Arabic word meaning a walled city, and Rabat is a word meaning the suburb around that walled city. These two towns together constitute the old capital of Malta, which is about 7 miles inland on a hill in the center of the island. It's a walled city that had, just like Valletta, had enormous fortifications. It was originally founded by the Phoenicians in the 8th century BC, although most of what you see now is mostly from the medieval period. After the Knights arrived in 1530, they moved their capital from here to Birgu, later named Vittoriosa, after the victory in the siege. And the town of Medina became little more than a backwater where wealthy merchants and nobles tended to still live. This is the main gate entering the city. The town is almost entirely car-free and has very narrow alleys, which are much more medieval in style than Valletta is. And it's called the Silent City because since it doesn't have any cars in it, it becomes extremely quiet at night, and does have just a lovely atmosphere for strolling. The streets are often very empty, particularly after day trippers have gone home. And there's gorgeous architecture to look at. Here are some unusual galleries in a completely different style. And the cathedral is well worth a visit. This is St. Paul's Cathedral on the site where St. Paul met Publius, the governor, after his shipwreck. They also have an excellent museum in the attached buildings where you can see a number of historic church objects, and even the relics of Governor Publius himself. This cathedral shares its role with St. John's, the elaborate cathedral we saw in Valletta, which is why both of them are called co-cathedrals. This also has a floor that is completely covered with elaborate, very detailed marble tombs. This one is a little unusual because Aloysius, who you can see in this tomb, has not actually died yet. He's the current church rector, and he is still alive, and his tomb is all ready for him when he dies. And the dome of the inside of the cathedral. If you walk all the way to the north side of Medina, you can walk along the bastions where there is a view all the way back over the entire island to the north. In fact, you can see, if you look in the right direction, this is that large church with the huge dome we saw before in Mosta. In Medina itself, there are a number of very beautiful churches. This is an unusual one in the Carmelite church because it has an oval dome rather than a round one. There are lots of beautiful little backwater alleys to walk through. Here's the cathedral and its dome. Many of the churches that you see in southern Italy and Malta as well are completely covered in lights that you can see in these little light bulbs all over the different parts of the facade of the building. Unfortunately, they tend to only illuminate them on the one day of the year that is the festival of the patron saint of that church. So it's rare that you might actually get to see one lit up. In Rabat, outside the walls of Medina, is the suburb area, which is a little bit more, is still a little bit newer than the medieval quarter, but has some very beautiful old buildings, including the shrine, which is in the cave where St. Paul supposedly stayed in the year 60 AD after his shipwreck on Malta. There are extensive catacombs that you can explore that were built during different time periods. Some of them are extremely early catacombs, and some of them were built much more recently, as late as the 19th and 20th century, and were used as shelters during the war. This is the parish church of St. Paul, where that grotto is underneath. And an example of an early catacomb going to the Roman period. These were used for burials. The smaller niches that you can see on the wall were used for children. Many of the catacomb areas were divided into specific zones for Christians, for Muslims, for Jews, and for pagans. And they're marked as such so that you can see which ones are which. Rabat is a much busier town than the adjacent Medina, mainly because it has more car traffic, but it still does have a lot of little lovely sections with narrow alleys and some very nice mansions open to the public. Here's another one that is still owned by the same family. They have family celebrations in this dining room. And the owner was happy to take us on a tour and show us all of the elegant furnishings inside. There's also in Rabat a superb Roman villa, which dates from a very early period. Considering Malta's location so close to Sicily and at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, you might think that there would be much more in the way of ancient Greek and Roman ruins, and there really isn't. You'll find a lot of that on Sicily and other islands around the Mediterranean, but for some reason, there is remarkably little of that in Malta. This is one of the few very well-preserved Roman structures. It was a villa of a wealthy Roman, and it has excellent preservation. Not far from Rabat and Medina, also about maybe a half an hour hike out of town, are these unusual walls. It looks like a miniature version of the Great Wall of China. These are called the Victoria Lines, and it's known locally as the Great Wall of Malta. It is not ancient. It was actually built in the late 19th century in the Victorian era, and hence the name Victoria Lines. It's about 7 or 8 miles of wall that still exist. It was built by the British. Remember, this was a British colony during that time period, and it was built completely across the island to defend the island from any attacks from the west. So several miles of the original wall still exist, and you can see them, and they're nice for hiking and walking across the countryside. But unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, they were never used in any kind of military function. Back in Medina, here is a nighttime view looking towards the city of Valletta off in the distance. So after the day trippers have gone home, you will pretty much have Medina to yourself. There's actually very little there anyway. There are a few shops that close up. There is only one hotel and only a couple of restaurants. So strolling Medina at night is a sort of transportive experience, and they light it up beautifully. The only hotel within the walls is quite expensive and quite fancy. I didn't stay there, but I did become friendly with a couple from New England that I ended up chatting with and hanging out with on a few days, and we decided to treat ourselves and go to this restaurant in the hotel, which was considered to be one of the best restaurants on the island. And I must admit, the view was spectacular, and the food, made of fresh local ingredients and traditional Maltese recipes, was quite good. Another thing to see in Medina is another house museum that's quite old. It's a 17-room mansion called the Palazzo Fauson that has excellent exhibits of art and also the lifestyle of the nobility. This would have been a mansion for a noble who would have been very wealthy, and it was most recently owned by a gentleman, a Maltese citizen, but of Swedish descent. He was a captain in both World War I and World War II. He became a knight and also an OBE of the British Empire. And he was also an avid art collector. So he gave the museum, he gave his home as a museum to the government when he died in 1962. And so you can see a lot of his personal furnishings and also the art objects that he collected. Paintings, sculpture, decorative arts, an incredible collection of silver. If you're wondering what that elaborate tall ship is in the middle, that was actually for passing condiments around a very large dinner table. You can see that it's on wheels. So if you needed the mustard or ketchup, you could wheel it down to the people at the other end of the table. And probably the most unusual item in his collection is this watch, which you may not initially recognize as being a little bit different. But if you look closely, you will see this is actually a watch with only 10 hours in a day instead of 12. This is a French revolutionary pocket watch back when, under Napoleon, he changed the calendar and he changed the clocks to be his own Napoleonic time and calendar. And this is only one of 3 French Revolutionary era pocket watches that is still in existence. Just below the hill that Medina sits on is another very elegant neighborhood called Attard, which has beautiful homes and gardens. This is the American Embassy. There are a number of gorgeous Art Nouveau mansions, and the Villa Bologna, which you can visit is one of the best house museums on the island. This was built in 1745 and is now open for events, and particularly nice to visit for its Baroque gardens, which are absolutely splendid, both for their flowers and also vegetables and fruit orchards. The day I was there, the house was actually closed for a wedding that was going to be taking place that afternoon, so we couldn't go into the house, but I could sit in the yard and pretend I lived there. Here are some more mansions in the Attard neighborhood. The other big thing in this neighborhood is Saint Anton Palace and Gardens, which is an 18th century country villa that is now the official residence of the president. And although you can't visit the house itself, the gardens, extensive gardens surrounding it, are open to the public as a large public botanical garden, and it has themed areas for different parts of the world. Here's an Asian-Japanese garden. And again, in springtime, it was just a beautiful place to be. And families stroll around and enjoy the fountains and the flowers and so forth. We're now going to move to the smaller islands of the archipelago of Malta. Gozo is much smaller and quieter. It has only about 7% of the total population. In the Maltese language, it's called Gaudesh. And Comino, which you can see on the lower right, is even smaller. It has no permanent residents. There's one small hotel, and it's mainly a site for diving and boating. We're going to land in Mjar, which is the main port of Gozo. There is no airport, so the only way to get to Gozo is by ferry, and this is the town that you arrive at. They have periodically talked about putting tunnels and bridges to connect the islands, but all of the proposals have been opposed for being either far too expensive, non-environmental, and none of them have really ever gone anywhere. Given that there's only about 3 miles between the islands, the ferry seems to be working perfectly well for the time being. In Victoria, which is the capital of Gozo, this is my guest house. A very pleasant little place to stay, and my room. The capital and largest town, Victoria, has 7,000 people in it, and like Medina on Malta, it is a fortified town that was built high on a hill, but unlike Medina, most of Victoria is actually now in ruins. This is the view from my bedroom window, looking up at the cathedral and the fortifications. And here's a model that gives you an idea of what what walled Victoria originally would have looked like. The Cathedral of the Assumption was built in the early 1700s after a very big earthquake in 1693 that affected much of the central Mediterranean. The ceiling is elaborate, and on the right you can see the dome. Interestingly enough, the dome is a trompe-l'oeil painting. It's completely flat and is simply painted to look like a dome. While I was there, it was under restoration, so they have a replica that you can look up at. But the dome itself is currently being restored. The church has a gorgeous Baroque interior. And from the tops of the fortifications, you can see all the way to the north coast. Again, bear in mind that Gozo is considerably smaller even than the island of Malta. So you can pretty much, in Victoria being in the middle, you can pretty much see every part of the island when you get up to the top, and it's only 3 or 4 miles in any direction to get to the water. Much of Victoria has been restored, but only the foundation walls, just to give you an idea of how the street pattern and the buildings would have originally been designed. Here's a view east to another large church in Shukia, a nearby town that we'll see a little bit later. And then looking north east to the town of Shara, which we'll visit shortly. Here's the main square in Victoria. Like Medina, Victoria is surrounded by its own little suburb. So newer buildings have sprung up in the new town all around. This is the Independence Square. Only a couple of miles away in the town of Shara, there are several interesting sites, the most important of which is called Gigantia. And it's the oldest of all of the temples on the Maltese Islands, dating to 3600 BC. So we are talking about something that is edging on to 6,000 years old. This is considered the second oldest structure, man-made structure on Earth, after one in eastern Turkey. It is made of a much harder form of limestone than the other temples that we've seen so far, so it doesn't have as much weathering. And as such, it is the only temple that does not now have a protective tent over it, which makes it a little bit easier to get the atmosphere of being in one of these isolated archaeological sites. It also has a superb museum with artifacts from the site that you can see. Here's a couple of examples of fat ladies again, representing fertility, and some very unusual figurines that were found at the site. Most of the villages on Gozo, as on Malta, were built on hills. So as long as you're in a village and climb up to the high point, you can pretty much see every other village on the island as well. This is a view over to Shukia, we'll see a little bit later. The Gigantia temple has the same semicircular apse design. Here's an altar and some other altars. The same kind of design that you see in all the other temples that we have seen so far. Many of the stones that you're looking at are up to 50 tons. And it is quite difficult to imagine how these early cultures, just like building the pyramids, were able to move such huge stones into place. This is another example of a local town. Shara is the closest town to where the Gigantia temples are located, and it's a very typical Maltese town, again, with a lovely parish church on the main piazza. This is actually the second largest town on Gozo. It has a windmill called Takola, which dates back to the period of the Knights Hospitallers, and it's still operational and still used as a demonstration site to grind grain, and also as a museum showing what rural life would have been like on the islands. And a very unusual thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in the middle of a little town is one of two grottos that you can visit. This is one called Sherry's Grotto. There are two caves that actually are under people's homes. This one was found when the owner back in the 1920s was digging a well to get water from under his house foundations, and they broke into a dramatic cavern. Here you can see the owner of the house, who took me on a tour into the basement. You go down a spiral staircase about 30 feet down from her basement. It was used as an air raid shelter during the war. A little further to the west is another beautiful site called Tapinu. This is a basilica to the Blessed Virgin, and is unusual in that it's the only church anywhere in the islands that is not in a village. And the reason for that is that it was built much later, in the 1920s. It is a pilgrimage shrine. It's been visited both by Pope John Paul II and also more recently by Pope Benedict. In the 1880s, a local woman had visions here and supposed miracles followed. And so they built a church in neo-Romanesque style. which is quite different from many of the more Baroque style churches that you see that were built a couple of hundred years earlier in Malta. This is the interior of the church, which is much more monochrome and soothing and serene than some of the elaborate decoration that you find in the Baroque churches. The setting is magnificent, and if you want, you can climb the hill immediately across the street, which has Stations of the Cross, and you can see the bell tower, which is 200 feet high, visible from all over that side of the island. And you get a great view in all directions. This is actually looking towards, on the left, you can see the fortifications at Victoria, where I was staying, and off in the distance further, the massive church in Shukia, and even further off in the mist, you can see the island of Malta. On the far western coast of Gozo is some more very dramatic coastal scenery around what's called Dweria Bay, with hiking, diving. There was an important site here called the Azure Window. You can see it here on the left. This was a famous natural stone arch, which unfortunately collapsed 3 years ago in 2017 during a very strong storm. And there was a proposal on the right. You can see this very modern museum, which was designed kind of as an experimental proposal to rebuild the exact same shape of the original stone and to turn it into a museum about Maltese ecology. It certainly looks good on paper. I'm not sure how successful it would have been in real life, but it ended up never going anywhere, so it doesn't look like it's ever going to be built. And now, unfortunately, the Azure Window is completely gone. Not far from this bay is a tiny town called San Lawrence, which has an unusual church with beautiful silver domes. Back in Victoria, at night, here is the cathedral and the citadel, and just like in Medina, it's extremely quiet at night. You may be the only person wandering around. The many streets and enjoying the beautiful evening light. In fact, it's so quiet you can hear the footsteps of a chihuahua on the front of the church. There are actually several museums in the old city that show what life would have been like to live there in the past. This is an early kitchen in one of those house museums. The unusual sort of sheep-shaped clay pot that you can see in the middle is, interestingly, a traditional clay pot for baking rabbit stew. You would think they would have made it look like a rabbit, but this is the traditional look. Here are some examples of different kinds of fish traps. And there's also an ancient prison where you can see the cells that prisoners would have been kept in, and the graffiti examples that they carved while they were imprisoned. On the north side of the island, you can see we're looking back actually east towards Comino, that uninhabited island where you can go diving, and Malta way off in the distance. The slightly brighter colored bay in the center is called the Blue Lagoon, which has, on a sunny day, which clearly this isn't, the water is an absolutely brilliant shade of blue, and it's a very popular place for diving. In fact, this is kind of an unusual photograph because there's no boats. If it were lovely weather, there would probably be 50 or 60 small boats all competing to enjoy the beautiful quiet. Gozo is the traditional home of the nymph Calypso in Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus was shipwrecked, and she enchanted him and kept him there for several years. Supposedly, according to local legend, that happened on this beach, and her cave is up on the hillside above. I'm standing right above it here. But the more prosaic and actually believable aspect of the North Coast is the many active salt pans. Goziton sea salt is considered to be of extremely excellent quality, as is the sea salt from nearby Sicily. And these are salt pans along the North Coast, where seawater is brought into these very shallow stone trays carved out of the local stone, and the evaporation leaves high quality sea salt left behind, which is then sold. And although these look like they may have been here for centuries, and they have, they are still used by active salt panners today. The clear water on this coast in particular is excellent for diving. Here is a currently working salt panner. And there are lots of nooks and crannies along this coast that make it excellent for hiking, swimming, diving. This is called Oued El Khazri, and another sleepy village. An advantage to spending time on Gozo after you have been on Malta is that the lifestyle, the amount of traffic, the number of residents, the number of tourists is much, much smaller on Gozo, so it has more of a feel of being off the beaten track. Here's another local parish church, brilliantly lit with neon. I have yet to understand why most Maltese churches, and many of those that I saw in Sicily as well, have garish neon lighting, but it seems to be the thing to do there. And this is just ordinary street life back in Victoria. St. George's Basilica in the newer part of the town is on a piazza surrounded by very good restaurants. This church was built in the 1670s. The interior is dark and completely over-the-top Baroque style. And the surrounding square is quite pleasant and full of good fish restaurants. Victoria is active in promoting its tourism, and in case you weren't sure how to get to the section of town that has Victoria's winding old narrow roads, they have an arrow to point you how to get there. Here's an example of one of the good fish restaurants. This is Barracuda that I had for dinner one night. And some lovely views of the citadel lit up at night. Now, Shukia, which I mentioned earlier, one of the other large towns and certainly the largest church on Gozo. This is another church of St. John the Baptist. This was completely built by locals and was not finished until 1978. It was constructed after World War II, even though this looks like this might have been built several hundred years ago during the Baroque era. You'll note that they are completely repaving the main plaza for better pedestrian access. This has the third largest dome in the world after St. Peter's and St. Paul's. Now, you may think that I already said that because the church in Mosta, which also has an enormous dome, claims to be the third largest dome in the world. The answer is that they're both right, and both towns vigorously argue over who is correct. And it kind of depends on how you measure. One of them is slightly wider in diameter. One of them is slightly taller. So depending on which you consider to be truly the most important dimension for size, you can align yourself with either the town of Mosta or the town of Shukia. Either way, they're both incredibly dramatic churches and quite beautiful. it certainly dominates the entire town, and in fact can be seen from all over the island. This church, on the other hand, the interior is quite plain, nowhere near as elaborately decorated as the one in Mosta. We're going to end by taking a quick spin along the southern coast of Gozo, which, similar to the southern coast of the larger island of Malta, has beautiful cliffs and coves. This one is called Shlendi. It's a very tiny little town that is just a tourist resort. There's not much there, except some beautiful coves and a tower that was one of many that were built by the Grand Masters to defend the islands in the 1600s. A little further along are the Tachenge Cliffs, which are among the best parts of the island for bird watching and cliff walking. In places they are 120 feet high and they go straight down. In bad weather, they can be very foreboding, but in good weather, they are extremely beautiful. Malta is a very big bird migration place, so it's a good spot to watch for seabirds and migrating birds from Europe to Africa. Unfortunately, hunting is still a very popular traditional sport in Malta, particularly in the spring and fall seasons. But there's all kinds of interesting plant life. Bird life. And fossils, too. Walking along these cliffs can be a little bit dangerous if you go towards the edge, so you have to be a bit careful. But on a nice day, the views in good weather are absolutely incredible. So finally, back in Dweria Bay, the rock that you can see in the center is called Fungus Rock. It's about 200 feet high, and it was famous in the Knights' time because of a fungus that grew there on this rock, which had miraculous medicinal properties. The Grand Masters of the Knights, in fact, had to post guards and declare the rock off limit to control access, and it is now a nature preserve. However, if you dig into it a little bit more, here's a model of the bay. On the right, you can see a model of this kind of fungus. The plant actually turns out not to be a fungus at all. This is in the Natural History Museum. It turns out it's actually just a parasitic flowery plant. It's not a fungus, and it has absolutely no medicinal properties whatsoever. So all the effort that they went to in the Middle Ages was for naught. But it makes an interesting story. Walking along these cliffs gives you a very clear idea of just how sedimentary all of these limestone layers are. And here's an overview of that bay with its crystal clear water for diving and the fungus rock off to the left. And if you hike along the cliffs, you'll see wildflowers. And eventually you'll come to the extreme southwestern tip of the entire archipelago. This is a Punic tomb site. It's completely abandoned. It's from about the 3rd century BC. There's a chamber dug into the cliff and a well in the front. And from there you can see an unobstructed view up the coast to the north. There's all kinds of weird weathered limestone along the cliffs. And also a spectacular view back towards the north, towards the center of the island, where you can see the Citadel of Victoria, fortified on the right, and way off in the distance is the town of Shara. Back in Mjar, on a sunny day in the harbor, this is how you get home. You hop the ferry and take it back to Malta. There are car ferries as well as passenger ferries, and they're fairly inexpensive and very frequent. And the entire trip, given that it's only about 3 miles, takes maybe 20 minutes at the most. The last thing I'll show you is St. Agatha's Tower, which is called the Red Tower for obvious reasons. And it's one of about 15 or so towers that were built by the knights in the 1600s around both of the islands for protection. And this is the last of the ones to be constructed and is the furthest west on the main island of Malta. So that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed traveling with me to this unusual destination that not many people know about. I hope you will join me again at the library, online, or on WCAT TV for more destinations. And again, to see more armchair travel photography, please follow me on Instagram, where you can find me using my name, Jeff Klapes, or hashtag _traveling_librarian. So thank you again, and keep exploring. I hope to see you soon.